Born in Kaduna. So my names are actually Eloho Omame.
Okay.
So I have an Yoruba name, I have a Yoruba name, I have a Hausa name. My mother is Yoruba, my father is Yoruba. I grew up in Lagos.
Okay, so born in Kaduna, grew up in Lagos.
Born in Kaduna. So my grandmother was Chief Mrs. Olakare. She was actually the first woman in Africa to qualify as a chartered accountant. She actually started ICANN here in Nigeria. She was one of the founding fellow members or whatever, IOD. I'm her first grandchild. And people assume that she put a lot of pressure on us. She never did anything like that. I remember celebrating my 21st birthday as part of my analyst class. I think we've been in the class about 8 weeks.
So you've been working since you were 21?
I have been working since I was 20. Since 2 months before my 21st birthday. So I started working for a venture capital firm out of London, focusing on Africa. I wanted to be on the continent. I wanted to be closer to the companies. I wanted to invest exclusively in African companies. First Check, I hope, is something that is around for a very long time. Whether or not I am involved in a day-to-day capacity at First Check Africa. My ADHD was diagnosed very late, so I'm learning many things in retrospect.
Hi there. You're welcome to another episode of Founders Connect. My name is Itimi, and as you know already, I'm your host. On Founders Connect, I have real conversations with amazing entrepreneurs and senior operators in the African tech ecosystem. We learn all about their journey, their mission, how they became who they are today, and then we also learn about the products that they're building and why they're also building it. On today's episode, I'm having a conversation with Eloho Omame. She's an African tech VC top tier. She's the partner at Telecom and also the general partner co-founder at First Check Africa. Hi, Eloho.
Hi, Peace.
How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a long week, but I'm very excited to finally sit down with you.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation. And you've told me it can be a relaxed conversation. So.
It is a relaxed conversation. It's just me and you talking, and then at some point, other people watch the conversation.
Cool.
This episode of Founders Connect is supported by IRL, an original podcast from Mozilla made for people who are into or build AI and develop tech policies. Mozilla IRL is available wherever you listen to your podcast. It is hosted by Bridget Todd, and you can also check it out on irlpodcast.org. It's great, trust me.
So let's start with your background.
Okay.
I like to, start from literally how you came about. Okay. So what was growing up like? Where did you grow up? What was family?
Yeah, I always say to people that you guys should convince me to run for president in this country one day, because I think I have one of the most maybe politically compatible.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is I was born in Kaduna. So my names are actually Eloho Omame.
Okay.
So I have an Yoruba name, I have a Yoruba name, I have a Hausa name. And then my mother is Yoruba. My father is from Delta State. So my father is Yoruba. I grew up in Lagos.
Okay, so born in Kaduna, grew up in Lagos.
Born in Kaduna, grew up in Lagos. So if you want a bit more history, my parents, my dad is a pilot, or is a retired pilot. So he used to teach at the flying school in Kaduna. My mother studied at Ahmadu Bello University, so they met in the north. And at some point along the line, I was born.
Okay.
And then I have, I was one of three. What else? What was it like growing up? I grew up in Lagos. I went to Chrisland School, primary, in Ikeja. We lived in Ikeja, in Okpebi. And then I went to Atlantic Hall, which was in Maryland. So I suppose my journey to both schools was never very far. I used to walk to primary school, and then the drive to secondary school was 10 minutes. And then, I don't know, growing up as a child, it was I think I had it fairly normal.
What would you say is your favorite childhood memory?
Favorite? I don't know if this is actually a memory or I made it up. Honestly, I just don't know. I think it's an actual memory. I must have been about 6 in the memory. And I remember it was Christmas. My mother was cooking. I fell asleep. I woke up and they allowed us to open Christmas presents. So in my family, Christmas presents opening was something that happened on Christmas Day after we had eaten.
Right.
So what was unusual here was it was before Christmas Day. It was at home in the evening, and maybe I was allowed, it was quite late actually, I was allowed to open a toy. I remember it being this blue cot. And you know that brand Chico that makes it makes toys and it makes things for kids. I remember that the pram was, or it was like a cot. It was a Chico cot. and there must have been a doll. I don't remember the doll, I remember the course. That's probably my nicest childhood memory. I remember waking up to the air conditioner being on, so it was very cool. My dad being there, my mom being there, my brother was asleep.
So you like gifts?
I don't know if I like gifts. Honestly, I think I like ACs. Or I liked ACs. My favorite thing of that memory is that I woke up and it was nice and cool. And I like blue, and the blue is very sort of vivid for me in that memory, so it's probably those two things.
Okay, is there any other thing that sticks out for me growing up?
Any other thing that sticks out? Yeah, I come from two large extended families, so a lot of my growing up had a lot of people in it, which I loved, but also two very different experiences.
Right.
My dad's side of the family, we would often travel to spend time with my dad's side of the family, so I didn't see them that often. My mom's side of the family, I probably saw every other weekend. My grandmother lived, we lived in Ikeja, my grandmother lived in Ikoyi. And they were both large families, so my mother is one of about 12, but it's complicated. My dad is also one of about 12, so lots of aunts, etc. So very big, but very different, and I think that's one thing that always stuck out for me.
Yeah. So what was school like? Growing up, primary, secondary, and then uni. What did you study as well?
Okay. Let me start from the end. So uni, I studied economics. I have a BSc in economics.
Where did that come from?
Where did it come from? Why?
Yeah.
There's no good answer to that question. I remember a conversation. So I when I was 15, I went to school in the UK. So I left Atlantic Hall and I went to school in the UK. And I think I was in lower sixth. You had to do 2 years of sixth form. And then I remember at some point in my lower sixth, our careers counselor, I don't remember his name, it was a man, sat me down and said, well, have you decided where you want to apply for uni? And I'm like, I barely know what's going on. I'm still trying to figure out what's going on. And then I remember he said to me that I should think about, he asked me what I enjoy, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe we had a conversation whereby he said, look, nothing really sticks out. I didn't want to be a doctor. I didn't want to, what have you. So I think he was trying to guide me towards studying something that could sort of keep a number of paths open for me. And he said, have you thought about economics? And that was really the beginning of it. So we started looking at economics courses. I think I was doing an economics A-level. I think I did economics, psychology, and something else. So it was kind of, it happened through a conversation. I didn't really have any other thing.
Did you end up liking it?
Some of it I did, some of it I didn't. But I think it's an interesting course. I'll probably have done a physics A-level. So I didn't do a physics A-level. I think I did a chemistry A-level or something. And then I would probably figure out, I would chart my path to be an engineer. And the reason for that is I think that I would probably still be doing the same thing I'm doing today. There are lots of engineers who do finance. But also, I think engineering is a course that teaches you to think in some pretty structured ways. Not necessarily think philosophically, but sort of think with frameworks and those kinds of things. I think engineers are some of the smartest people I know. So by extension, maybe the osmosis of that. I don't know, I think it'd be cool to be an engineer. I have a cousin who's an engineer. She's a software engineer. I just think it's really cool.
Okay. Okay. So one of the things that you mentioned now was your A-levels teacher helping you decide that you were going to study economics. Yeah. If you think about growing up between then and your earlier years, are there other people that have helped you sort of like pave the way and say, maybe go this way, like nudge you a little bit?
I didn't have a lot of, I count it as something I was very lucky with. Some people people will say things like these memes, African children, if you're not a doctor, you're not a whatever. I never really had that. So I think they're funny, but like it wasn't my experience.
Fair enough.
So I didn't have nudging in the way of these are kind of your prescribed paths. The funny conversation, my mother, I remember when we were growing up, would have conversations with her. She said, my mother's a lawyer. And she would say, and her father was a lawyer. Her mother is an accountant or was an accountant. My mother would say things like, my children, I want one of you to be an accountant, one of you to be a doctor. I don't care which one. I just want to have children that are whatever. And we would just laugh at her and roll our eyes. And interestingly, none of us sort of, ended up in those kind of professional paths. So I didn't feel nudging in that way. I think the way that we were nudged though was we were encouraged to sort of do the things that interested us, but generally to do them pretty well. That was my encouragement. So it was never a case of why are you doing this, why are you not doing this, or a girl should do this, or I didn't have that. I had more sort of, so this is what you've done. Why didn't you come first? I had that stuff.
Right.
It didn't really matter what it was.
Right.
It was like, well, if you've chosen to do this thing, then you've got to be heads down and do it well.
That's something you still carry with you today.
That's something I still carry. Yeah, I guess both sides of that. I don't feel a lot of pressure from my parents or from anybody. Actually, before I say that part, let me say something else. The other thing that was probably an influence in my life, in fact, it was a marked influence in my life, was my grandmother, who I mentioned she was an accountant. She was actually the first woman in Africa to qualify as a chartered accountant.
Wow, history.
Yeah, so my grandmother was Chief Mrs. Olakari, and she was the first woman in Africa to be a chartered accountant. She actually started ICANN here in Nigeria. She was one of the founding fellow members or whatever of IOD. She died about 5 years ago. I'm her first grandchild. And people assume that she put a lot of pressure on us. And again, she was never she never did anything like that. But I think it was really, I found her very intriguing in many ways. And I think I then, the intrigue or the curiosity about her then turned into inspiration. So the older I got, the more I was like, wow, that's actually really cool. So I'm not the first female anything, but I think it's pretty cool. So maybe that was, call it, I don't know, I wouldn't use the word pressure. I sort of think of it more as inspiration.
Yeah, if you're going to give more context to how she has inspired you, how would you flesh that out? Has it been specific decisions that you've made or just something you've done? You're like, this kind of came from my grandma.
I think that I'm grateful that I've never really had any expectations in my life around glass ceilings. And I think that's her. I don't think that I don't face them. I think we all do. And so I think as a Black woman, you do.
Yeah, it's natural.
I think you do. But it's never been something that I'm very conscious of. And it's something that I'm grateful to her for. Because I think growing up with somebody who just seemed to, whatever the construct was around what a woman could do, she seemed to always be doing something a little bit, she was always doing more than that. So for example, she had 7 children. She, like I said, was one of the founding fellows of IOD. She sort of started ICANN. She's done everything. She's done public service, So I'm grateful that I didn't grow up, I had that inspiration, but I also didn't have the framework or the lens of, but only so far. So I think that's one thing that I would say is I take from her, and I kind of get to kind of hide a little bit. In some ways, maybe some other people are not as lucky to do. I get to say to myself, well, she did it, so and she was pretty relatable. She was normal. She was my grandmother. So how hard can it be?
Yeah.
So I think I'm lucky enough to have that. Other points of inspiration in my life would be my father. My father's not flappable in many ways. And I think part of why I admire that in him is he wasn't always like that. I remember him growing up, my father was pretty flappable. And then, he just went through a phase where he said, actually, I want to be a little bit different. I want to be not easily riled. My father started an airline. My father was one of the founding, there were 4 of them, entrepreneurs behind ADC Airlines. And that was not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think I saw him grow and mature and just be this really calm, unflappable person through that. So that's something that I find really, really interesting, really inspiring. My mother, she's a lawyer. My sister and I always kind of tease her. My mother, if my mother is interested in something, and I mean things like, my mother wanted to podcast or something, and she made a podcast. Then she wanted to learn to make jewelry, and she was making jewelry. And then she, and that is in addition to having a professional career. So my mother, I always sort of think about her as the person who reminds me that I can do anything at any age. My mother called me up tomorrow and said, I'm picking up this new hobby. Give her 6 months, she's going to be excellent at it. It's not a skill I've quite mastered, but it's something that I think, and it's interesting, the older I get, the more I look to her for that. Because I do think that I'm inspired by people who live their their careers are in what they call phases and cycles. So you do one thing for maybe 20 years, and you do another thing, and you do another thing for another 20 years, and then next thing you know, you've had 3 cycles or 4 cycles of doing things that you actually really enjoyed and you did them well. And so I hope to do that over time. And whenever I kind of think of it, gosh, this is getting hard, I think of my mum. And I'm like, you know,
she could do anything right now.
Yeah, she could probably do it. So that's helpful.
So let's talk about work. After school, economics, you did an MBA.
Yeah.
Let's talk about career. So after
path?
graduating,
Okay.
Where I'm headed to is how you got to First Check and Telecom. So we're going to do the entire journey. Yes.
Right, the entire journey. The journey was, I finished my undergrad, so I studied economics in London, and then I started working at an investment bank. So I joined as an investment banking analyst. I remember celebrating my 21st birthday as part of my analyst class. I think we've been in the class about 8 weeks.
So you've been working since you were 21?
I have been working since I was 20, since 2 months before my 21st birthday.
Wow, that's very young.
I know, right?
I mean, Tito can relate though.
I know, it does not always crack up to you. You get tired after a while, but yeah. I have been. I remember celebrating my 21st birthday about 2 months into my new job. So I did that, and then I worked at another investment bank, same kind of thing.
In the UK?
In the UK. Yeah. So investment banking in total was about 6-7 years. And then when I finished that, I now have to remember the history. When I finished that, I came back to Nigeria. Actually, no, I didn't finish it. Investment banking in the UK was about 5 years. Then I came to Nigeria, more investment banking in Nigeria for about another 2-3 years. And then...
When did you do your MBA? Was it around this time?
Not yet.
Oh, okay.
And then I did another 2-3 years at First Bank.
Okay.
And at First Bank, I was I was head of corporate development at First Bank. And I laugh because I was not prepared. All of the good and bad reasons, as you might imagine. So I'd come with an investment banking background, but I had no experience navigating. I think at the time First Bank had something like 16,000 staff. Everybody that worked for me and around me was older than me.
And you had just moved to...
And I had just moved back. So there were so many things that I was everything from that girl that just came back from London to like, I was a fish out of water. And I did that for about 2-3 years, and then the MBA.
Okay, so before we get there, let's backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
5 years investment banking before you then moved back to Nigeria and then worked at First Bank. What made you move back?
Oh, okay. I moved back. I wanted to be closer to my family. Okay. We had a family tragedy, and I just didn't want to be in the UK anymore. I didn't want to be that far away. I felt like my parents needed me to be closer. In fairness, neither of them said they needed me to be closer, and who knows, maybe they didn't. But I felt like they did.
Is that what you meant when you said you were 3?
That's what I meant.
Okay.
I had a brother that passed away. Sorry. So my brother died many years ago. And I always say to people, I'm going to tell you something personal. I always say to people that I don't remember I know the dates. Like if you ask me the date and I had to think about it, I know. But I couldn't tell you it was X years ago because I kind of blocked that part. But yeah, so that was what happened. And I just thought, what are you doing here? I was in this investment banking job, and it was really interesting. It's funny, I was saying to I think my husband or something, that I think I've had a lot of luck in my career. So I was very lucky to have this job where, do you remember Blackberries? Blackberries, where
the phone.
The black one, the actual black ones that had the tiny screen and whatever. Those very first ones. You can imagine being 20 years old and your first job is a job in which somebody hands you a Blackberry, and you're doing things like you're traveling every 2 weeks or every month to different client sites, and every time you're traveling, you have to say, oh, is my car outside? And someone says the car is going. So I kind of started with this kind of early career where it was pretty unrealistic. But I also lived alone very early. When I finished undergrad and when I went to, I suppose, A-levels and finished undergrad, I never went back home.
Right.
So it was literally off to do A-levels at 15 and I never came back. And so it meant that I'd kind of built this very, call it independent, but also call it isolated life, right? Where I lived by myself. I didn't really answer to anybody. I had enough money, but I was always broke. It's really interesting. You know how, because you didn't grow up, your first job was someone gave you too much money. So you never learned how to manage money. Yeah. So I always never had money. I mean, I paid my rent and stuff, but the point is, it wasn't like I had saving. I was just kind of and so there are many, many things that I did that I would do differently now. But the point I'm making is that when we did have the family tragedy, my brother died, it was kind of time to come home. It was like, well, this thing you've kind of been doing for the last 6 or 7 years, it's probably not one, you're lonely, 2, your family is far away from you, 3, do you really want to go back and kind of keep doing the same thing? Right. Do you want to go back to being alone? That kind of thing. So I think, honestly, that was the real driver. And then a secondary conversation I had with myself was, okay, so when you do move, what are you going to do? Do you want to keep doing the same work? And I think the two things were a little bit timely. So on the one hand, there was kind of the personal, which was the overwhelming, and I kind of say that very openly, the overwhelming reason for I want to move back. But like I said, the secondary portion was, do I really like what I'm doing day to day? And the answer to that question was in 2 parts. I like the nuts and bolts of it. I liked companies. I liked being, honestly, people say they hate investment banking. Me, I liked it. And maybe that's part of my personality, I don't know. I liked the numbers. I liked the financial analysis. I liked being trusted with
frameworks.
Frameworks. I liked being trusted with a client deck. I liked running a model. I liked preparing it. I liked all the little things that we had to do as investment banking analysts, even though we worked long hours. And so I wanted to keep doing those parts. The parts I didn't find so interesting were that a lot of the clients that I was, the teams, I was part of teams that were serving were large European conglomerates. Nothing against them, but I just didn't find them very relatable. And I found that was the beginning of a set of questions around, I started asking myself, well, how come I don't see, where are these kinds of, so some of my clients were people like, or our clients were people like Cadbury, or Lindt, the chocolate manufacturer, or Haribo was a big client of ours. Heineken was a huge client of ours. Guinness, right? Diageo, etc. So I was in the consumer products group, and it was everything from FMCG to spirits and things like that. And I remember people was always coming up to you, do you know the largest Guinness, whatever is in Nigeria? Yes, I knew that. All my bosses thought it was really cool to tell me that trivia. But the point is that I started asking myself, well, where are these companies in Nigeria? And of course, the answer to the question is, well, there's Guinness Nigeria PLC, there's whatever. I'm like, no. Not the European subsidiaries of, not the Nigerian subsidiaries or the African subsidiaries of large European companies. Where are the Nigerian companies? Another thing that I spent a lot of time doing at the time was we would, like I said, we were kind of out of London, but European. I worked at Credit Suisse, so we were sort of the European consumer products team, coverage team. And so I would often, as part of these teams, we would fly to France or we'd fly to Germany, and we would meet businesses where, I don't know, you'd meet the top management, and of the top management, one person would be the grandson of the founder of the company or something, or the granddaughter of the whatever, or 30% of the company is still owned by the family. And I remember just saying, well, why don't we have this in Nigeria? Why don't we have these generational businesses that have scaled to the point where a portion of the business is now IPO'd? And so that was the beginning of, so those two things were kind of happening for me at the same time. And that was the beginning of the journey to being back in Nigeria, working with Nigerian companies, and investing in Nigerian companies.
Have you ever tried accessing an app or playing a game that requires you to accept privacy policy, and then you just tick to accept without actually reading it? I'm very guilty of this, and I think a lot of people are. The thing is, like, we're almost always in a hurry to just get on board with what we're trying to do, and sometimes, like, it's really fun and entertaining that we don't pay attention to the privacy policy. But you know what? They might actually be selling your personal data to third parties. I listened to the privacy policy episode of the IRL podcast, the one supported by Mozilla, and it talked about how privacy policies can be lengthy to read daunting and sometimes confusing. And sometimes these companies do this on purpose. Yes, they actually want you to tick without reading because they want to be able to sell your personal data to third parties to do God knows what with. It's crazy, right? Listening made me realize and decided to become maybe more conscious about just making sure that I am very mindful of what I say yes to, what terms and conditions I accept when on the internet. Because like online life is our real life, right? And the more we spend so much time on the internet, the more cautious we have to be about what we consent to as regards to our personal data. I've learned so much from just listening to the IRL podcast. It's one of my favorite podcasts now. I think everybody should actually listen to it. There's just so much to learn about the online world that we so enjoy engaging on multiple times in a day. IRL podcast is available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Just search IRL online in its real life, or you can visit irlpodcast.org and listen. It's pretty good. Let's go back to the video.
Okay, so you did First Bank, then you did the MBA, and then what happened?
First bank, then I went to the MBA. So
what did you do when you came back from the MBA? Did you pivot? Did you?
I call it a pivot if you want me to sound a bit more interesting than I am. I don't think it was that great a pivot. So I finished the MBA and I started working for. That was the first time I then went into venture capital.
Okay.
So I started working for a venture capital firm out of London, focusing on Africa.
Okay.
And it was the first time then that I'd gone from, the journey from a curiosity around where are the African companies.
So that you could actually
help
build them.
Okay, how can I work with African companies, etc. So I started working with a technology investment firm, a venture capital firm in the UK, but focused on Africa. And then it was the first time, when I say Africa, it was really Nigeria for the most part, Kenya, and a little bit of my time was South Africa. My job was to get to know the tech ecosystem in Nigeria. And sort of, first meetings were people like Tayo of Paga and Sim of Konga, and things like that. Yeah.
How long did you do that for?
About 4 years.
Oh, so you stayed in London again for another 4 years?
Yeah.
But traveling.
So I was here a lot, but yes. I wanted to be on the continent. I wanted to be closer to the companies. I wanted to invest exclusively in African companies. I was with a firm that had what they call, a global pool of capital. So different firms, investment firms and venture capital firms are structured differently, but in their case, it basically meant that there was one pool of capital. They were investing in about 5-6 different geographies. And it was not, it was a growth stage firm as well. So a limited number of deals were being done per geography every year. And so I realized very quickly that we're going to probably do one Africa deal maybe every 3 to 5 years. At the pace we were moving at. And I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to invest more frequently. I also looked at the ecosystem that we were investing in, and it wasn't what it is today, right? So 10 years ago, you could count the tech companies on one hand, the total amount of capital that they had raised. So I think at the time, I remember looking at Konga, I think at the time Konga had raised $50 million or something. And we were looking to invest $50 million per company, deal by deal, right? So it also meant that there was a limited number of private tech company investments that you could make. There just wasn't the capacity to absorb that on a deal by deal basis. So I just thought, look, I need to be doing earlier stage, smaller checks, investing much more often, that kind of thing. And so I decided to move back.
Okay, so after moving back, we still have like Lagos Innovates, then we have Endeavor.
Okay.
It's a long career. We must go through everything.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so
I moved back without a job. And so the first thing I did when I moved back was then Lagos Innovates.
When you moved the first time, did you move without a job as well? Did you find First Bank when you moved, when you had already?
Oh no, but don't forget I was already in Nigeria. So remember the investment banking, I came to Nigeria as an investment banker. Sure. Did I move with a job? Yes, because what had happened then was that I was at Credit Suisse. I moved with Credit Suisse,
Right.
interestingly enough, because at the time they were thinking about opening up a representative office in Nigeria. There was a director at the time, a Nigerian director, who was going to be leading that effort. I had said I wanted to leave, so I told you, I sort of shared the personal reasons why, and I told my boss at the time that I wanted to leave. I had the sweetest boss. He's German. His name is Jens Welter. He's actually now at UBS, super senior at UBS. Like, I follow his LinkedIn, I'm like, wow. But he's like super smart. I think he was the youngest ever MD or something at Credit Suisse. He had become the managing director at 30 or something. Really nice guy, really kind. I sort of think about him as a role model for, you know,
How you want to.
for how I want to be, or what a good boss looks like. But anyway, so I told Jens that I wanted to leave at the time, and he said, no, don't leave, you can't leave, we can't lose you. And I said, well, you know, I want to be back in Nigeria, and there's no Credit Suisse in Nigeria. He goes, don't worry, there's this. So he comes back a few weeks later and says, okay, I've spoken to whoever he'd spoken to, and there's this director who is supposed to be helping us start looking at whether or not we want to start an office in Nigeria. He said, why don't you talk to him? And so you don't leave the firm, or you don't leave the bank. You are based in Nigeria, but you're now doing something different. And he goes, look, you can still work with us sometimes, but you know, you'll be there and whatever. So that was the move back.
Right. So this was the first time you were moving back and you didn't have anything.
I did have something because I did that.
Yeah.
So, but this second time I did not have something. You're right. And it was a leap of faith. I knew what I didn't want to be doing. So, for example, I was being encouraged to look at more deals in other markets. I was like, oh, why don't you look at Turkey? And nothing against Turkey, but I just didn't see how I had any real kind of advantage being an investor in Turkey, especially as a black woman. We minimize that. But I'm not sure I would show up in Turkey and start trying to prospect for deals in Turkey and it would be too hard. It would be too heavy of a lift for me anyway at the time, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't want to do that. So I knew what I didn't want to do. I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know I'm going to take this job at this place. When the Lagos Innovates thing came around, I feel like I've been very lucky in my career. That was also luck. And what I mean by that is that, so Akin Oyebode at the time, who was Commissioner of Finance at Ekiti State, at the time, he was Executive Secretary of the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund. And, well, at the time, they had just, I guess, inaugurated him as the first Executive Secretary of the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund. And he's a friend. And he was talking about all the different things to a few of us. I mean, there were a few of us that would talk about our work. And so he would talk about what he was trying to do with LSCTF. And I would always have ideas. And I would say, well, what are you going to do for startups? What are you going to, whatever. And so we find, even till today, we still kind of, look at startups together. And we could talk about that. And then he said, I want to allocate a piece of the capital that he had for wealth job creation at Lagos Innovates to tech startups. And I said, great. And then he said he wanted to sort of create an RFP around the work and stuff like that, and he did. And I pitched for it, and it was really, I had to meet the board. I mean, I'm sure everybody that pitched did, or everybody that was shortlisted did. We had to meet the board, this, that, and the other. You had to design a framework for what the ideas that you had and what you wanted to. And I remember, as part of my pitch to the board, I used to work these really late, back to this hyper-focus thing. I used to have days when I would barely sleep, and I'd be working on my presentation, or my proposal. And I remember there's one particular slide where I'd done lots of studying and what have you. I was looking at, there's something called Startup Chile and a few other government programs like that. And I was sort of looking at, why they were successful, how they were successful, where they failed, what they could have done better. I was interviewing people. And then I was trying to kind of visualize and bring to life, what I had in mind around Lagos Innovates. And I remember saying, so I knocked up a slide, and I remember doing it. I sort of put together a slide, and I put a light bulb on the slide, and I kind of designed something that was supposed to be like a bit of a graphic, but I'm not a graphic artist. I kind of knocked this thing. It had a light bulb, it had a hand or something, and I just said Lagos Innovates. And I remember it was a pretty competitive process to get it. When we did get it, so I had my sort of small consultancy. When we did get it, I remember one of the first early meetings with the team at LSCTF. And I said, well, so let's talk about all the different things. Let's also talk about what we want to call it and what we want to brand it. And I said, so this was the slide that we knocked up. Ignore the name. Let's think about other names. And I remember Akin said, why are we ignoring the name? I said, oh no, because it was just meant to be to show you what you
Yeah.
know. And he goes, no, I like it, let's use it. And that's how it
Lagos
became
Innovates.
Lagos Innovates. Endeavor, the work was different. Endeavor, again, it was another kind of, I would say, journey of learning about different things. Endeavor was the first time, so I'd gone from, the consulting work that we'd done for Lagos Innovates, and then I was approached to sort of set up Endeavor in Nigeria. And so Endeavor had its board. I was used to boards at this point. But I'd never really been the CEO that had a board of 10 people or something like that at Endeavor. The chair of my board was Mr. Atedo Peterside. My board was some pretty well-established corporate people,
Right.
who were all on multiple boards, were used to large boards, were used to large companies, were used to people who had been CEOs for 20 years. And so I knew that every time I walked into a board meeting or I picked up the phone and talked to one of them, I couldn't be this person who, I'm trying to just figure it out.
You had to come correct.
I had to, and it was really interesting. They were very gracious and patient and supportive. But again, it was another baptism by fire, right? So
Feels like all the work has been baptism by fire in different ways.
it has been. Interestingly, I didn't really think about it that way, but I remember my first board meeting at Endeavor. I'd never run them. I mean, I'd presented to boards, but I didn't have the same thing at stake. I'd been the person who gets called into the board meeting, do your presentation, and leave. Now, the chair was running the board meetings, or maybe I was. I don't know. The point is that they were my board meetings. I was picking board dates. I was setting the board meeting agendas. The decks
Everything
were
was
mine.
at stake for you this time.
Everything was at stake. My budget was being challenged in a board meeting. I would have to introduce my new hires to a board meeting. I need to think about, what I discuss inside the board meeting, what I discuss outside the board meeting, which sounds trivial, but actually it's not. And so that was really interesting. And so now, if you kind of, roll it forward, now when I work with entrepreneurs and we're putting together their boards and I'm helping them think about, I remember I had a question recently from an entrepreneur saying, how do you decide? It was his first board. He's sort of Series A. And he says, we were talking about communicating with your board and your board members. And he says, well, I don't know, how do you decide what is a matter, what is a thing to, even if it's not really a board matter, what do you decide what to discuss and what to mention to the board? And I mean, there's a bit of context there, but I remember I said to him, well, there are probably 3 ways that you want to think about it. The first is something that is a board matter, of course, should be discussed at the board, right? So something that, for example, boards have things they call reserve matters. If it's a reserve matter, then it should be discussed at the board. There was a second thing I don't remember. But the third thing was, ask yourself, what is something that you don't want your board to find out, you don't want to surprise your board with, which is really interesting. And I was able to give him that advice because I had that experience of my board, what on earth did I just hear? And you're like, I didn't think I needed to tell you. And they're like, what do you mean? You don't want that as the CEO. You don't want to surprise your board members. So that was stuff I learned.
And what was the third one? So
I can't remember. I remember it was part of the conversation. I remember we decided on a framework that had 3 elements to it. The first was something that is a reserve matter. Okay. The first was something that is a reserve matter. The second was something that, feel free to sort of think of your board as a sounding board and a place that you go for advice. So if it's something that's complex and you need input and stuff, then discuss it with your board. And then the third
something you don't want to surprise them with.
Something that they shouldn't be surprised with.
Right.
Should be at least mentioned at the board. But that's something I kind of picked up whilst I was at Endeavor, right? No one really ever sort of.
So that was what made the Endeavor experience very different. Just the level of responsibility you felt like you had
across
at the time.
kind of managing up and managing down, right? So it was the first time I had a pretty big P&L, and it was my job to raise my money and collect my money. It was my job to pay my people, keep the lights on, find the office, everything. It was my job to everything, right? It was my job to, you name it. There was nobody.
When
There
you
was no
think,
infrastructure that I plugged
Yeah.
into. There was no one to kind of think about those things with.
we're gonna speed up a little
Yeah.
bit. I know that, or at least I think if I remember correctly, there was a break between Endeavor and First Check. Was there? Or at least the announcement.
Yeah.
Okay. But I wanted to ask about First Check, leaving Endeavor and saying, hey, I want to then go start my own thing with a co-founder, and then the idea behind we want to just back female-focused businesses, and how that's paying off.
Yeah. People kind of ask this question sometimes as if I left Endeavor to start First Check. No, First Check would have happened regardless. Like First Check, I hope is something that is around for a very long time. I hope First Check, whether or not I am, involved in a day-to-day capacity at First Check Africa, I probably will be for a very long time. But if tomorrow, for whatever reason, I wasn't able to be, I want to believe that First Check Africa carries on. And so that was more the mindset around First Check Africa. It wasn't really about starting one thing, finishing one thing to start First Check Africa. It was like, I really, really want to do this thing. And so, back to sort of what we said right at the beginning around kind of thinking about careers and cycles and portfolios and things like that. I was really kind of thinking a lot around the pandemic, I guess, of sort of, look, I want to do something else. I want to add something else to the things that I spend my time doing. You've taken me on this journey, but if you want, one thing that is true about all of those things was I was always doing one thing at a time.
Yeah.
Many people do many things at a time. I didn't have, like you, I didn't have that experience. I always used to watch all of you like, how on earth does she do, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to do more than one thing. I wanted to do more than one. So that was a little bit what First Check Africa was,
Right.
or is. It's the thing that I will do for a long time, and it'll
Regardless
always be
of what
running in the background.
Right.
Yeah. So the why is interesting. Odun, my co-founder of First Check Africa, who's also a founder herself, co-founder of Piggyvest, she tells this story.
She gets at a dinner table or lunch or something.
It was coffee.
Coffee.
We were at coffee, and I'd invited her out for coffee, and she tells the story about how we were talking about. I kind of said, so her version of the story starts. My version starts maybe 3 months before hers does. So my version is that I was at Endeavor, and I was. So I talked about kind of how we worked at Endeavor and sort of building our pipeline and who we wanted to target and bring in. I remember pulling all of that together, and there were no women, or there were very few women on the list. And it was like high growth tech, this, that, and they're very, but high growth tech, scale up stage, which is kind of like Series A, etc. Now, part of what Endeavor prides itself on is, if you've done a good job building an Endeavor community, Endeavor network in an ecosystem over some time, you then have, you hope for what we call this role model effect and this multiplier effect. And so when people say, who are the top entrepreneurs and whatever, many of them are Endeavor entrepreneurs, right? So that's kind of an internal measure for Endeavor in terms of what a successful office looks like. And so for me, as I built my pipeline, I was always very conscious that the pipeline that I was building was also kind of my lens on who I would like to see, or who I thought would be the emerging role models from an entrepreneurial perspective anywhere in our ecosystem. And I found it quite disturbing that I would have a list of 20 entrepreneurs and 2 of them would be women, or 1. And I was, to be honest, I'll admit this here, I was a little bit ashamed of that. And then I started saying, okay, so you've just got to figure out how to be, they must be out there. So you've got to figure out how to be a bit more intentional about pulling them in. And I realized that the primary challenge was a stage one, in that a lot of really ambitious, very capable women who are just starting their companies. And so if you say, a Series A company is probably 4 years into its journey, it's grown quite significantly, it's raised quite a bit of venture capital, and also VC had historically not really invested that much in women. And so we were just at the beginning of that cycle as well. So it made sense, from a pipeline perspective, why I was not getting the numbers that I wanted, but I kind of went on this journey to figure out why. And so it was part of that I sort of reached out to Audron. So at the time, of course, if you then draw a list, the list is 2 people. maybe I'm
Or
being
this
gracious.
number one.
Or this one. So I remember reaching out to her and I said, let's have lunch, and let's have coffee, and I introduced myself, and I sort of said what I was doing. And I said, so who am I missing? Who else is there? And I just said, there are not that many. And I remember she went through a list with me. But more importantly, we then had a more expansive conversation where we were talking about female representation in general, across the ecosystem, from the investment standpoint, from the entrepreneurial standpoint. And I was saying, a little bit, I suppose, maybe I didn't use those words, but a little bit kind of what I said just now, which was I was a little bit kind of embarrassed, right? I was like, how can you be playing this role and you're not able to sort of influence this or drive this? And I remember her saying she really wanted to do something as well, and we played with a few ideas, and then we left it. And then during the pandemic, I think it was towards the tail end of the lockdowns, we were friendly, and then she stayed over at mine one time, and we would have breakfast. We were having breakfast one day at the dining table, and we started talking about it again. And I don't know, for some reason, it took, the whole conversation was maybe 30 minutes. We were like, yeah, let's do this thing. And that was the beginning of it.
What would you say has been the biggest lesson you've learned in the last 10, 15 years of your career?
The biggest, wow.
So I'm thinking, maybe I have like another 8, 9 years to get to how many years of work experience that you have.
Yeah, but don't count the number of years because it's kind of irrelevant. Because my point is, maybe I spent twice the amount of time.
Yeah, but I mean, for me, it's like, okay, if I wanted to get to the point where you are in just like the amount of impact that you have,
right,
and the amount of growth that you've also have, and say, hey, Peace, you could do it faster by maybe replicating this stint. What would those lessons be?
Okay, so let me talk to you about mistakes.
Okay.
Because I think that, avoid my mistakes, maybe.
Yeah.
You started off by asking me why economics, and I said, well, I don't really know if someone convinced me to do economics, and it turned out to be a good decision, and if I were to do something differently, I'd probably do. I think that as much as I talk about luck being a factor, I think I've been very lucky. I also think I've enjoyed a good amount of privilege that has meant that a lot of things didn't feel like a lot of risk, right? I felt like I could take a bit of risk. I felt like it was okay to fail. I think in some ways, if I was a little bit more conscious of some of those dynamics, I would have done a lot of things faster. Faster, smarter. I would have, for example, I don't think I needed to have done an economics degree and whatever, to then turn around and say to myself, actually, if I could do that all over again, why didn't I do engineering to begin with, right? Nobody really precluded me. I just didn't really sort of apply myself to the thought process. I thought it would be fine in the end. And it was, but it could have been different. So I think just sort of being present. That said, again, my ADHD was diagnosed very late, so I learned many things. I'm learning many things in retrospect. I don't think it's that unusual for someone that kind of, has the neurodivergence that I do, that you don't necessarily kind of think about things in a linear way, in the same way some other people might have done. So there's that. So I'm not approaching that from a place of regret, but I think just sort of the focus and the clarity of what do you want to do, what do you enjoy, apply this.
Probably learning how your brain works
and all of that a little bit earlier.
Okay. Is there anything that you tell to female founders or female CEOs?
Anything?
Yeah.
No, not really. Just keep pushing. I sort of, I'm always very careful with the advice that I give women, or at least giving women advice. I try to be very cautious and thoughtful about the advice that I give to women, because I worry sometimes that things that may seem well-intentioned actually can be a little bit counterproductive sometimes. So I try not to give women advice that is too vastly different from men, from the advice I might give a man. So what I would say to female founders and female CEOs is, you don't need me to give you advice on being a female CEO. I mean, if you're a woman and you're a CEO, you're probably doing okay. So keep doing more of that. We all need to keep doing more of that. I think visibility matters. I think representation matters. So someone who's doing either of those things is somebody that I have a lot of respect and admiration for. I think that is important that we, I think it's important that we are not siloed, either by ourselves or by other people. I think we should fight to be in the mainstream. I remember a conversation where somebody said, well, a woman said, I'm not a female founder, I'm a founder. Why do I need to be a female founder? I smiled. You are a female founder. And what I mean by that is your experience is different. It's going to be different.
It's different,
And so as much as I agree 100% that you shouldn't be siloed by or defined by who you are, that's exactly the opposite of what one is trying to achieve. I think there's such a wonderful role that there's wonderful opportunity in that visibility. And it would be a shame to kind of dampen it because you don't want to name something that is happening already. Like people do.
People have to go and name it.
Do you know what I mean?
Anyway.
Like, so yeah, I'm not going to call myself that, fine, but other people will. What is much more important to me is that you remember that I think it's a very special thing, and it's a privilege, and it's an opportunity to be visible, to be a role model, all of these things. So I get pretty, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. I think you're cool if you're a female CEO and a female founder.
Yeah, makes sense. Final question. What do you think the next 5 to 10 years of your career looks like? Are you going to enter a third phase?
I'm not ready for my third phase though.
This
is my second phase.
Yeah.
So the next 5-10 years of my career probably looks pretty similar to now, in that it's more of the same. Investing in African companies, doing more investing in female founders, building out First Check Africa, investing as a member of the investment team at TLCom. I think the next 5 years as an ecosystem is going to be really interesting. We're going through a bit of a winter at the moment. If you think about the way economic cycles work, in 5 years we should be maybe even about to start another. We should certainly be at the tail end of a better, of a slightly better dynamic or a better dynamic. So I think there's a lot to learn. I think as an ecosystem, this is kind of when we grow up. So the next 5 years, I think like many other people that are doing similar things to me, it's heads down, learning and supporting founders and investing in them and helping them build their companies. The next phase starts, cycle 3 starts in 10 years. Maybe.
In 10 years?
Yeah.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much. Is there any final words? If there's one thing you want someone watching this, because it's been like 1 hour conversation.
Okay.
They're like, if you forget every other thing about my story, I want you to remember this one thing from me. What would it be? And we'll use that to wrap up.
One thing, if you remember anything else about my story, I'm a big believer in female role modelship, the importance of it, and the fact that it's inevitable that we're going to get to a point where you won't be counting them on one hand.
Yes.
So, the next job is what's the journey from here to there. But I'm not in any doubt in my mind that
we'll get there.
There is pretty amazing. I think there are many of us that need to do the work to help us get there.
Yes, I agree. And we're going to keep spotlighting them. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. You've given me more time than we bargained for,
okay.
But it was a very interesting conversation.
Thanks, peace. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And thank you guys for watching Founders Connect. Make sure you don't leave this channel without subscribing. I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.